Good morning. This is Senator Dick Black, and I'm happy to be with you. This is Focus on the News. Today we're going to have a bit of a monologue because I want to talk about something that is extraordinarily important. The news media touched on it, but it certainly didn't get the sort of play that it deserved. What we're going to be talking about is the danger of nuclear war that we have just recently encountered. Here's what's going on. The United States and NATO are virtually on a nuclear razor's edge. Article 5 of the NATO Charter is really a very diabolical provision because it says that an attack on one member is automatically an attack on all 30 members of NATO. Now, because of this, if anything happens to trigger this great interlocking mechanism, it puts thermonuclear war, certainly the Third World War, just on a hair trigger. NATO comprises close to 1 billion population. It's about 950 million. They have a defense budget that is 20 times that of Russia's. So if you were to have something occur that triggered this alliance into action, a single miscalculation, it could literally provoke a global nuclear bloodbath. Now, this came close to happening just recently, and you would think that this would be headlines all over the news for weeks and weeks. How did this happen? What should we be doing? There were some low-key articles about it, but we'll go into those. Interestingly, the Washington Post carried a very good article on it on November the 17th. They had a headline that said, "How an anonymous source raised false alarm of Russian strike on Poland." And their lead-in sentence to the article said, and I quote, "The Associated Press sent a terrifying news alert around the world on Tuesday," end quote. At 2 p.m., the Associated Press had written, quote, "A senior U.S. intelligence official says Russian missiles crossed into NATO member Poland, killing 2 people." The news agency noted that the Polish government had begun holding emergency meetings due to a crisis situation. Now, by the time that the Associated Press took down its flawed report, it was viewed by thousands of news outlets across the world, and many of them went out and published wild-eyed headlines based on this flawed article. Now, because the errant missile had exploded just inside the Polish border, Polish Foreign Minister Zbigniew Rau summoned the Russian ambassador and demanded immediate, detailed explanations. Now, meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky hysterically accused Russia of bombarding Poland. Now, even as he did so, he must have known that it was actually a Ukrainian missile that had caused the blast, not a Russian one. Because all of these missiles are very carefully tracked so that you know how effective they were, you know which targets have been hit, which targets have been intercepted. Now, alone among all the world's nations, Ukraine still denies that it was Ukraine that fired the missile. It still blames Russia, understandably. This anonymous intelligence assessment that formed the basis for the Associated Press article blamed Moscow, and this immediately triggered demands for a no-fly zone. Now, a no-fly zone is the Ukrainian holy grail, because what it would do, it would embroil American jets in dogfights with Russian pilots, and it would cause the U.S. to launch bomb strikes against Russian air defense batteries. World War III would be a highly likely result of a no-fly zone. The British Independent reported, this is the headline, Biden convenes emergency G7 NATO meeting after Russian-made rockets strike Poland. It spoke about the fact that the president was awakened after midnight to news of the missile explosion. And President Biden went on Twitter promising full support for Poland's investigation and reaffirming America's ironclad commitment to NATO, which implies an ironclad commitment to follow Article 5 of the treaty and to take actions towards war. Now, those are my words, not President Biden. Now, in the excitement of the moment, the world media went on with this claim. Fox News cited a senior U.S. official and reports on the ground that a Russian missile had hit Poland. CNN reported that Poland confirms, quote, confirms that a Russian-made missile, end quote, was responsible for the blast. And the Daily Mail wrote, Russian bombs kill 2 in Poland. The most upset article that I could find was actually in the Washington Examiner, which we often refer to for good reporting, and this one was perhaps not one of their best reports, because they reported, they said, and quote, apparent Russian missile strike in Poland is a major escalation. They then went on to discuss, the Washington Examiner went on to discuss the possibility that Poland might invoke Article 5 of the NATO Defense Treaty by saying, and this is a quote from the Examiner, if Poland believes it has been deliberately attacked, it would have cause to ask for and expect U.S. military support in targeting Russian missile forces. And while triggering Article 5 does not require NATO members to conduct military operations, that is the expectation, end quote. An unidentified senior, the unidentified senior U.S. intelligence official that was cited by the AP falsely claimed that multiple Russian missiles had crossed into Poland. But even Poland's official statement says there was just a single missile. So why would U.S. intelligence purposefully exaggerate the facts? And why would U.S. intelligence, why would NATO officials be called to an emergency nighttime meeting to respond to an obvious missile malfunction, regardless of whether it was Russian or Ukrainian? Does any sentient person imagine that Russians would choose to attack Poland with a single missile by targeting an old grain silo in a tiny farm village of 500 people? We've reached a point where an event so trivial could become the eventual tripwire for global conflict. This incident proves that NATO is fully primed for a 1914 moment, that time when the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife sparked a war that killed 18 million people, World War I, and led to World War II, which killed another 50 million. The next war that we face won't be limited to 50 million people. It could literally kill billions of people, men, women, children, and could very well end civilization as we know it. We have to start beginning to ask ourselves, is this worth it? Do we want to destroy human civilization because a couple of farmers are killed at a grain silo? Now, America and the West can have peace in Ukraine and draw back from World War II whenever we choose to do so. But thus far, the US and the UK have repeatedly blocked peace talks to end hostilities. The first goes all the way back to the beginning of the war, which was 2014, when the CIA and British MI6 helped to overthrow the duly elected legitimate government of Ukraine and install a puppet government. After that, we began pouring weapons in to build up a very powerful Ukrainian army, which attacked the areas along the Russian border, mostly the Donbass, which was the two small republics, the Donetsk Republic and the Lugansk Republic. These both declared their independence in reaction to legislation passed by the new revolutionary junta that we had installed. This junta passed some intensely anti-Russian laws that really diminished all the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine to second-class citizenship. Ukraine has about 30% people who are native-speaking Russians. They speak Russian as their first language. They tend to be clustered along the border with Russia, just across the border in the Donbass, in Crimea, in some of these other areas that the Russians have since occupied. But in 2014, there were Minsk peace accords that were organized by Germany and France because they feared this war coming about, and they could see the buildup starting for a great European war. So Germany and France put pressure on Ukraine to get to the peace table, and they did. And Ukraine agreed. They signed the treaty documents and gave their solemn pledge that they would end hostilities with the Donbass region. They never did. They violated their agreements. And part of the reason that they violated them is that the United States and Great Britain made it very clear that we were pouring weapons in, and we managed to convince the right people that the war should continue, and so it did. But that was an historic opportunity to end the war, to end hostilities, actually to preserve the old Ukrainian border. There was no downside in it for Ukraine, only for people who wanted to move this globalist agenda forward in the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, that wasn't the last opportunity for peace, because after Russia crossed the border, keep in mind, Russia had not joined the war during the first 7 or 8 years of its existence. It started in 2014 with the Ukrainian army attacking the Russian-speaking areas in the Donbass. That went on. 14,000 people were killed, mostly civilians in the Donbass. So it was not a small war. This was a significant war. Russia stayed out of the conflict. They desperately wanted to avoid war, but finally, as NATO began this huge Ukrainian buildup around the Donbass, it became very clear that it's just a matter of days before the Ukrainian army surged forth and conquered the Donbass. And keep in mind, these two areas had declared independence, much like the colonies declared independence during the American Revolutionary War. They had very real reasons for declaring independence, one of them being that they were now being ruled by a revolutionary junta and not by a government that they had elected. And so in any event, Russia comes across the border February 24th of 2022. There are some sharp conflicts, but both sides, particularly Russia was very, very cautious in the way that it approached the war. They were overly optimistic. The Russians thought that the Ukrainians would quickly give in, that they could install their own government, and then they could leave and things would be fine. Didn't work out that way. The Ukrainians fought with great vigor. And so you reached a point in April 2022, President Zelensky of Ukraine, sent a 5-page peace proposal to President Putin. And it laid out the framework for peace talks. They engaged in peace talks, and those talks were going very, very well. President Putin backed the talks, Zelensky backed the talks, and the sides had almost arrived at a satisfactory resolution of the hostilities. David Arakhamia, I apologize for the pronunciation, Arakhamia, he even told Ukrainian television that, and I quote, "The Russian Federation has given an official answer to all positions, which is that they are willing to accept the Ukrainian position, except for the issue of Crimea," end quote. So, and the issue of Crimea was sort of a red herring. The Ukrainians knew that Russia wasn't going to bend on that. But they, like with real estate contracts, you sometimes put something in there so that you can get out of the agreement up until the last minute. So that's what was being done there. But Ukraine was pleased with the agreement they had arranged on. Russia was pleased with it. And in April, this is just shortly after Russia entered the war. So the casualties, there were casualties, and I don't want to over minimize them, but they were just a tiny fraction of what took place afterwards. The number of casualties was small. Additionally, the property damage was very minimal. Russia had gone out of its way to avoid damaging any infrastructure, anything of historical value, and so the damage was something that could have quickly been repaired. However, while the peace talks were proceeding smoothly, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew unexpectedly into Kiev, and he had very harsh discussions with Zelensky and made it clear that that they better cut off these peace talks and get back to fighting the war. The US, the UK, NATO had invested an enormous amount of money, and they did not expect that the Ukrainians would just quit the war and leave all of that investment on the table. So So the United States and UK blocked peace in April, saving easily costing easily 100,000 lives. From April on, I think by anyone's estimate, there have been 100,000 people killed on the Ukrainian and the Russian side. But that wasn't the end of the peace overtures either, because very recently, just a week and a half ago, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, told the Economic Club of New York that a victory by Ukraine may not be achieved militarily, and that winter provided a good opportunity to begin negotiations with Russia. Now, when he said this, apparently it hadn't been completely coordinated, because the administration was really taken aback by it. They didn't like the fact that he had mentioned peace, and they went into damage control. They wanted to assure that Russia would not use this pause in winter fighting to begin peace talks. And they made it clear that the United States expects to continue supporting Ukraine's next military advances on the battlefield. So once again, we have the United States blocking peace, promoting death and destruction for both Ukraine and for Russia. Now, we've really reached a point where the actions taken by NATO have become so extraordinarily reckless. And we see this latest incident where the Associated Press, by a single issue about one stray missile, happened to be a Ukrainian missile, but it hit across the Polish border. And based on that single Associated Press article, you had the entire world suddenly about to pounce into World War III, perhaps triggering a nuclear holocaust that would kill almost everyone in the Washington metropolitan region, including all of Northern Virginia, all of Washington, D.C., much of the state of Maryland, in addition to wiping out the naval port in Norfolk, the Norfolk Navy Yards, and probably almost exterminating the population of the city of New York and other major American cities. This is what we're talking about. This war with Ukraine it's totally unnecessary. Had we not overthrown, this is under Barack Obama, he gave the okay to overthrow the government of Ukraine. We had State Department people, we had CIA people there working on the ground, working to promote this war. And had we never done that, had we not overturned the government, there would be peace and there would be relative prosperity in Ukraine, in Russia. So the entire thing it's really become Obama's folly. He launched this war. He took the actions that laid all of the groundwork for a great war in Europe. And that's exactly what we have achieved. It's a very terrible, very dangerous thing, very sad for the people of Russia and of Ukraine who have suffered so much from our meddling around in their affairs needlessly. So That's all that I'm going to go into today, but we will talk a little bit more about Ukraine probably next week, or rather not next week, but on Wednesday. We've got our follow-on podcast on Wednesday at 11 o'clock. So I've given you a few things to think about, and I welcome you back to the show, Focus on the News, on Wednesday at 11. Thank you very much.